Hey guys, we are here to discuss um, the mono blue Tron archetype. Um, so this would be the deck tech, which I surprisingly hadn't done at this point. So we'll start by talking about the lands. I don't think that you'd start by talking about Tron without talking about the lands. You have Urza's Mine, Urza's Power Plant, and Urza's Tower, each of which the mine and power plant are each going to produce 2 colorless mana apiece if you have all 3 on the board, and Urza's Tower will produce 3. So this allows you to produce large amounts of mana just by having 3 coinciding parts. Um, so the deck aims to ramp into large threats and an infinite loop. The rest of the mana base is just 8 islands. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Um, 1 ghost quarter and 1 mirror pool. The mirror pool is kind of a flex slot. I've seen people run 2 academy ruins, 2 ghost quarter, 2 academy ruins, and 2 ghost quarter. So I've seen a lot of different things done with this slot. I've been quite pleased with mirror pool in this slot up to this point. So for now, it's going to stay. But it's very possible that it can flip-flop back and forth. And then the last land is Academy Ruins. Academy Ruins is one of our key cards for our infinite combo. Pay 1 and a blue, tap Academy Ruins, put target artifact card from your graveyard on top of your library. Okay, so this combo's out with a number of different cards in our deck, but most specifically with Mindslaver. Mindslaver is a 6-drop artifact, which is important. We'll get that in a minute. That when you pay 4 and sacrifice it, you control target player during that player's next turn. What's really incredible about Mindslaver plus Academy Ruins is that you can infinitely loop turns, and you can control your opponent's turn effectively, milling them out, because you just tap all of their lands and then pass, and they will essentially, it creates an infinite loop that causes them to put their entire library into their graveyard, or whatever is in the library into the graveyard. It's not going to force them to shuffle their graveyard back in. So that's one of the major infinite combos of the deck. The other ones, of course, are making infinite Wormcoil Engines, which is a 6/6 Death Touch Lifelinker for 6. When it's put in the graveyard, you get a colorless worm with lifelink and a colorless worm with Death Touch. Very powerful card. You can produce infinite Sundering Titans, which when it enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield, choose a land of each basic land type and then destroy these lands. And by infinite, I mean you just never run out of them. So it's not like you're making a buttload of tokens that are Sundering Titans. It's just that you have an infinite loop where you don't ever lose your Sundering Titan permanently to non-exiling effects. Platinum Angels. You can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. That's a fairly powerful effect. And it's a 7-drop. So those are your big threats that do this. You can also Oblivion Stone, which happens to be a really great way to keep an opponent stalled out, like wasting spells and abilities until they run out of things. Pardon me, run out of things in their hand. So those are your major ways of doing that. Now you're probably thinking, but deck builder, how do I, ensure that I'm going to get my 3 Tron lands, as they're dubbed, out on the field and produce a lot of mana? Well, this is where the rest of your instance and kind of artifacts come into play. So we'll start with Thirst for Knowledge, which is one of the powerful draw spells of this deck. Draw 3 cards and discard 2 unless you discard an artifact card. This is very powerful in that it's a 3-drop that draws 3 at instant speed. So that's one card that is quite effective in digging out your Tron pieces, but more specifically perhaps Expedition Map is a 1-drop that you pay 2, sacrifice it, and search your library for a land card, reveal it, put in your hand, and shuffle your library. So this is your most effective way of finding your Tron pieces. Um, and then aside from that, you have a lot of ways of stalling into a point at which you have your Tron pieces assembled, such as Remand, which most people are going to be familiar with. Counter target spell, put it back in your opponent's hand, and then you draw a card. So it doesn't put it in the graveyard, but it's essentially a cantrip that slows down your opponent. Mana Leak is basically the same thing, except it doesn't put it back in their hand, just counters it unless its controller pays 3. And it doesn't draw you a card. So the reason I compare those two is because they occupy the 2 mana slot for counter spells. So each of these helps you kind of stabilize before you can reach your Tron pieces and play your large threats. Aside from those, you have Repeals, which bounces target permanent. Well, come on. There we go. With converted mana cost X or less. With converted mana cost X specifically to its opponent's hand, and then you draw a card. This is something where you can bounce your own things in return, and draw a card, which is often not the right path, but can be used as a way of drawing a card if you don't have anything to bounce. Spell Burst is a soft lock at the end of the day. It's got Buyback 3, which Buyback is probably the most broken ability ever printed. But what it essentially allows you to do is counter a spell and then put Spell Burst back in your hand. So if your opponent can only play one spell a turn, you essentially lock them out of the game. Or if they can only play one non-instant speed card a turn, so that you counter like a Goyf and then counter, a Siege Rhino or something on the same turn. So that's one of our nice techs. It's a 1-of though because it is an expensive spell. You have a 1 times Cyclonic Rift, which is kind of your emergency panic button, right? So if you fall too far behind, you can bounce everything and then give yourself another turn to find the pieces that you need. Lastly, for instance, Condescend, or I guess second to last, Condescend is one of the key cards to the deck in that it uses your large amounts of mana to counter spells and then allows you to scry 2, which is incredibly powerful because then you get to look at the next 2, set up your next 2 draws, and then go from there. Lastly, we have Dismember. Dismember gives target creature -5/-5 to the end of turn. And you reduce the amount of pain that you take from this card with Dimir Signets, which are yet another way of ramping in this deck. Lastly, we have some interesting tech that perhaps some of which is new and some of which is old. Fabricate searches your library for any artifact, put it in your hand, and shuffle your library. So this helps us tutor our Mindslaver combo. Oblivion Stone and Expedition Map are perhaps the ones that are the most sought after by Fabricate when you're not just trying to combo out, because it's the one. Fabricate tutors for anything, whereas Treasure Mage tutors for mostly your win conditions. It searches for an artifact with converted mana cost 6 or greater. So these two occupy the same slot. Treasure Mage perhaps looking more for your win cons than Fabricate does. And then the last 2 things that we're going to go over are Thought-Knot Seer, which is the newest addition to the deck. When it enters the battlefield, you basically Thoughtseize your opponent, except you exile it. And when it dies, when it leaves the battlefield, target opponent draws a card. That is important because I think a lot of people have been missing that clause, thinking that it said died. So when it leaves the battlefield, target opponent draws a card. And lastly, Ugin. Ugin is just fantastic against any deck that's running colored spells, which is essentially everything but Eldrazi, which Eldrazi probably won't be too much of a threat to this deck in the next couple of weeks once it loses one of its major ramp portions. Moving to the sideboard, Spellskite is our newest addition, so we'll start with that. Spellskite is fantastic against Infect decks. It's very good against Boggles, or as LSV recently pointed out, that it's actually spelled Bogles, so it doesn't make any sense to be called Boggles. I hear you, LSV. I thought the same thing when I first saw the card. So it's good against the Boggles deck. And it also is very good against Burn. So those are three very key decks that this deck kind of struggles against in terms of speed. So it allows us a turn 2 play against very fast decks that keep us alive. Spatial Contortion is also a new addition. This is good against aggressive decks as well for killing off small creatures, which turns off some of their clock. It slows them down just a little bit. 2 Relic of Progenitus is good against Goryo's Vengeance decks. It's good against Living End. It can be good in the more control-y matchups such as Jund and Grixis for different reasons, because in Grixis it turns off Snapcaster and in Jund it turns off Tarmogoyf, but it's generally not the best card in those matchups. If you run into the random Dredge decks, it happens to be good in those kinds of places. So Relic is a versatile card, but I wouldn't necessarily say to board it in every single game. 2 Negates, fantastic in the control matchup. It's good against Delver. It's one of those spells that is just, if you're running into a lot of counter magic, you probably are going to board this in. Hurkyl's Recall, return all artifact target player owns to his or her hand. This is very good against Lantern control. It's good against Affinity, though obviously if we were running red we would prefer to destroy all their artifacts, but against Affinity this is a big tempo swing and can often save your life. And lastly, it's good against eggs if you ever run into that. Although I would say that if you're playing against eggs, it's probably best to do this on your turn. I don't know, it's a little bit tricky to play this card against eggs, because it's really, essentially they're just going to play it all back out and continue to draw just as they were before. So it's potentially good in that position. Echoing Truth is very good against blue-black fairy. It's good against black-white tokens or any tokens producing deck. And obviously it's your defense mechanism against Kiki core decks. Now that Twin's out of the format. But those are the 3 decks it's really fantastic against. But of course there are other decks that are going to be running multiple copies of things. A lot of the times it's just a 2-mana bounce spell, which can be important if you feel like you're just behind. But those are the 3, I think, major players. Maybe Abzan if you feel like Lingering Souls is that powerful, but I don't think that that's something that you would want to do. Dispel, again, really comes in for control matchups. It's good against Burn as well. Anything that's running a copious amount of instants, Dispel is very good against. Lastly, Dismember and Aetherize. Dismember is good against the BGX matchups. Anything that's running like 5 toughness creatures, which are hard to deal with without, your major threats on the board, is something that Dismember might be good against. It kills things like Celestial Colonnade. It kills Stormbreath Dragons if you're playing against Scred Red. It kills a great assortment of things, and it's one of our versatile kill spells. It's about our only kill spell aside from Spatial Contortion. So grindy creature matchups is what Dismember is for. Aetherize is very good against Affinity. It can be good against Infect, although a little bit slow for that. It's also good against a lot of creature-based matchups. So if you feel like someone's going to be attacking you a lot, it's something that you can board in. It probably isn't great against Abzan Koko, but like you might bring in one just so that they don't beat you just with creatures. So it's a versatile spell that can be brought in against a lot of creature decks. It's very good against manlands because those can't be targeted by repeal. So this is kind of the intro to U-Tron. Let me know what you think, and thanks for watching. See you guys next time.